in order to pave the way for for a free, independent, and secure and stable society. And that's what we thought in 2004, that we should do that. And then at the time, Belarus, Lukashenko had been there since 1994, I believe, and he had already staged fraudulent elections. At that point, we had, and we still are, along with all of our national Baltic organizations, in a coalition of Central and East European organizations, the CEC, and the main Belarusian organization, the Belarusian Association of America, is a member of that. So we got to be familiar with Belarus issues at the time. And then Lukashenko certainly wasn't anybody to admire. And so we started working a little bit with them. We were advised in 2003, I think, or 2005 to consider inviting a Belarusian opposition person, Vinchuk Viachorka, to one of our conferences, and he came, and I remember that, meeting him, and he really gave a great presentation, and then opened our eyes, at least at that conference, to what was going on in Belarus and what we needed to know. And certainly human rights was a central factor about why we should be interested in what was going on and developments in neighboring Belarus. And that it expanded over the years, and we started working on the Belarus Democracy Act, because that was what was needed to be done in the U.S. Congress to help support the opposition, democracy, civil society, free media in Belarus, and we have a renewed Belarus Democracy Act that needs to be passed in Congress now. We had work to bring members of the House into a caucus that focused on Belarus for a while. That caucus is no longer around, but working with the Baltic Caucus, Belarus has been a issue of interest with many of the members. John Shimkus, who's the co-chair, or the outgoing co-chair of the House Baltic Caucus, has taken a personal interest in Belarus. He's traveled there to be an election observer, supported legislation, and so forth. And then on the Democratic side, Marcy Kaptur, for instance, Jonas, you can say more about her, has been a wonderful supporter of Belarus as well. So I think we were enlightened back in the early 2000s about what was going on in Belarus, and since then have taken a continued interest. This election certainly was terrible again, and we have to react. And if it's not us, the Balts here in the U.S. to support that, to help our Belarusian friends and sisters and brothers, then who will it be? And if it's not the Lithuanians, especially because of all the great work that Lithuania has done to support Belarus, then who else? Who else will it be? And we've seen the Lithuanian government has staked a lot on Belarus. From the going back to the European Humanities University and allowing that to exist in Lithuania, to allow and to welcome Belarusians, opposition people, and anybody who has to get away from Lukashenko and his regime to stay in Belarus for as long as it takes. And that all continues. And again, I think we're emboldened after yesterday that we see that there's there is hope. If you work at it, if you believe, and I think we'll continue to do that.
Okay. Karl, well, thank you for that overview. We're going to dive in to those topics a little bit more. You covered a lot of ground, and we appreciate that. Agnia, thank you so much for joining us and being on call a little bit earlier as we ran through our agenda a little bit more quickly than we had planned. Please introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Agnia Grigas. It's a pleasure to be here, first of all. I'm a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. I'm also Lithuanian American. I was actually born in Lithuania and moved to the States when I was 10 years old, right in 1990. My work, my academic work is really on this region, on Eastern Europe, US foreign policy towards Eastern Europe, and energy policy. And I've recently, of course, have been following and writing about the events in Belarus. And I think I've been asked to maybe speak a little bit about it, but I'm happy to take also, any leads or any questions on what specifically you'd like me to speak about.
Absolutely. And for our attendees, please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A or in the chat of our panelists. So Agnia, Karl provided an overview of kind of a more historical view of Lietuva's involvement with NATO, its inclusion, ascension to NATO, but also the continued relationships between Lietuva and Belarus, obviously being neighbors. Could you talk a little bit more about maybe the current situation in Belarus and the role that Lietuva has played?
Absolutely. So of course the events since August have, gripped the attention of not only Lietuva, but of the United States and the world. What we've seen since August, well, first we saw a presidential election, and generally it has been accepted that this election was fraudulent. A woman by the name of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her supporters feel she's won the election, and there's been a lot of fraud, which has allowed Lukashenko, who's been in power for nearly 30 years, to basically not cede power and remain in office. Now, since then, basically since these elections in August, we've had extensive protests in Belarus. Interestingly, these protests have also been led by women. So it's been an interesting type of almost women's movement. I think maybe there have been several reasons for this, maybe because of Tikhanovskaya's immediate party, but also because I think the men, if they are arrested, they maybe face even more brutal reprisals against them than maybe initially the women perceived that they would face. Now, of course, they faced, brutal tortures and, I won't go into all of it, but, they've faced very harsh reprisals after arrests. So, of course, this situation now has been ongoing since August. Tikhanovskaya has fled to Lithuania, where she has received kind of political asylum there. She continues, so she's living in Lithuania, in Vilnius, with her children, while her husband is in jail in Belarus. The Lithuanian government has really supported her. And from Vilnius as her base, she's meeting with US administrators, EU leaders. She's traveling across the European Union to build her case. So Lithuania is, already very evidently involved. Lithuania was the first country to say that they no longer accept Lukashenko as the legitimate president of Belarus. They say they accept Tikhanovskaya as the legitimate leader, and countries, most now Western countries have followed Lithuania's suit, including the United States, Canada, UK, EU, in terms of not recognizing Lukashenko. So, but I want to maybe, I don't know how many, American Lithuanians are really following in great detail Belarus, unless you really kind of work on those issues. And I wanted to maybe just kind of make maybe 3 points to really get the point across. Well, why should we care? I mean, why should we as Lithuanians, as American Lithuanians, care about Belarus? So first, the natural, if you look at geography, Lithuania shares a long border with Belarus, and there's just clear geographic proximity. I mean, between the capital of Vilnius and Minsk, the capital of Belarus, it's just 100 miles. So, I mean, imagine that. This is very, very close. So naturally, whatever happens in Belarus is of great importance to Lithuania. I mean, let's imagine if there's war in Belarus, if there's instability. Let's say if Russia takes over Belarus, which it has tried to do in Ukraine, starting the war in eastern Ukraine. So naturally, this really matters for Lithuania and its security, its society, and so on. I mean, just tremendous geographic proximity. There's also some cultural ties and ongoing cultural ties that we just, already I heard Karl mention. There's the, diaspora, Belarusian diaspora in Vilnius. There has been the Humanities University there. There's, the border, people traveling back and forth across the border, trade, business, and so on. So again, my first point, just great geographic proximity and everything that goes along with it. Second point, really, if we look at, and I don't know how many of you have seen photographs of the protests in Minsk, in Belarus, you'd be just surprised. I think maybe some Lithuanian Americans would be surprised to see the symbols that they carry. So they carry Vytis. They carry, you know, our Lithuanian national symbol. And why is that the case? Well, this is because of a tremendous common history that Lithuania and Belarus share. So during, you know, our greatest historical periods, during the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, much of the Belarusian lands were part of the Lithuanian Grand Duchy. Many of our, you know, greatest cities and castles and greatest noble families lived during the time in Belarus. So Belarus and a lot of the Belarusian people who now feel they're having their national revival, they look back to the Lithuanian Grand Duchy. So they, you know, they look back to that common history, and it's very important to them. And again, they view that the Vytis is also their national symbol, because maybe that was a time when Belarus, you know, was kind of an independent, more independent, more Western country that was not, you know, taken over by the Tsarist Empire or later the Soviet empires. So, and the same for Lithuanians, of course. I mean, if you study Lithuanian history, you know, many of the events, the people and so on that take place, they will be in part in Belarusian lands. And, you know, the third element, I would say that why, you know, this should really matter for American Lithuanians or Lithuanians overall, or Americans, is really, this is a question about democracy. You know, today, well, just here, we've had elections, we have the privilege of having the opportunity to go and vote and change your government. You know, Lithuania has had that privilege since the 90s, and the Belarusian people have really not had that. And it's part of America's principles to support democracy abroad. And it's also part of Lithuania's foreign policy goals and principles and values, is to support the self-determination of people and to support democracy abroad. So maybe these are kind of my three key reasons. If, let's say you haven't maybe been following up so much on the intricacies of Belarus, maybe you know, hardly heard about the country, as, you know, frankly, many Americans have hardly heard about it. But for us Lithuanian Americans, again, we share tremendous geographic proximity. And imagine if, let's say, Russia takes over Belarus, you know, we'd be sharing a long border with Russia then. Second, we share a long history that's important to us and important to the Belarusian people today. That's why they're out in the streets with what, you know, we would perceive as our national symbols. And third, this is important for Lithuanians and Americans in terms of their most basic values and principles in terms of supporting democracy and democratic governments. So I'll end here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for also explaining the cultural ties between Lietuva and Belarus. I think many of us who participated in the Baltic Way this summer, the commemoration of the 30 years, which just so happened to be in conjunction with what was going on in Belarus in unfortunate circumstances, but it was really cool to see Lithuanian flags, Latvian flag, Estonian flag, Polish flag, but the Belarus flag of white, red, white with the Vytis in the middle, which I think is a great example, as you said, of our shared history, shared culture with Belarus, even though they don't speak Litovishkai, we don't have that common language, but we do have common history, and certainly being neighbors. It's actually a good segue. Linus asked a question about the Ostrovets nuclear plant. And that is a major issue in why this is important to Lietuva. So you were talking about why should Lietuva care about this? Please explain Ostrovets to us.
Yes. So basically, you know, the Ostrovets nuclear power plant, that has been a very hot issue, and really a security issue for Lithuania. So Belarus and the Lukashenko government have been planning on building, well, actually hiring the Russians to build a nuclear power plant in Belarus, close to the border of Lithuania, even closer than Minsk. So it's under 100 miles. I mean, this is like, becomes like 40, 50 miles away from Lithuania. So so the Russians would build this nuclear power plant in Belarus. Of course, there are concerns now, concerns about nuclear safety. I mean, of course, people remember Chernobyl. I mean, the Lithuanians remember that very well. There are also concerns about, really efforts to have more energy dominance again in the region, and various sorts of, even information uncertainty. I mean, what if there's a kind of any sort of nuclear accident in Belarus? Will there be information? Will Vilnius have to evacuate? Questions of that nature. There's been concerns that the project has not been followed based on the highest nuclear standards. That's kind of an argument that Lithuania has been making for decades, but it's been very hard for Lithuania to really kind of change Lukashenko's policy or change Russia's policy on this plant. So there's hope. That's another issue why the Lithuanians are very concerned about the government in the country, in Belarus. If there's a change of government, maybe there could be a reassessment of the plans for this nuclear power plant. I think that's another hope that Lithuanians share. Because at least with the current Lukashenko government, Lithuanians haven't been able to do much to alter those plans.
If I can just add on a little bit to that, and I wanted to say hi to Agnia. It's really nice to see you. It's been a while. Labas.
Hi, Karl.
Hi. So I'm also I've been thinking about and reading about recently about the another Russian nuclear power plant at Sosnovyy Bor, which is helps to electrify St. Petersburg. It's halfway between Narva and St. Petersburg on the Baltic coast. And actually, in 1995, as a student at Helsinki University, I was able to visit the nuclear power plant there. But it's of this old construction, and there are always fears there as well about leaks, about things falling apart, and so the track record, I think, Agnia, as you had mentioned, of Russian engineered products and especially nuclear power plants, hasn't been so good, and I think that's really the fear, that there may be something, the defects, and there have already been technical problems with it, and so that keeps us all on edge. So I hope that there is an opportunity down the road to renegotiate that. I mean, we saw what happened to the Lithuanian nuclear power plants. As a condition for joining the EU, they had to decommission, and the second plant was not possible to build. So in a European future, and I think with more interest in let's say non-traditional energy sources or renewables and things like that, we have to look in those directions.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a little bit about the picture, the overall energy picture in this region. I mean, this region is energy poor, essentially. I mean, they don't have natural gas, they don't have oil, and the region is dependent on imports. And in the past, like Lithuania was dependent on nuclear power with its own kind of Ignalina nuclear power plant, which was a kind of Chernobyl-style nuclear power plant. So when that was decommissioned because of EU requirements, there's been, always this question of, well, where will we get our energy? And, Russia has always used kind of energy exports or potential, as a type of, negotiating tool. So for them, seeing this kind of energy shortage, also building this nuclear power plant in Belarus, they potentially could gain a market, at least for the time being, in the Baltic states. Now, of course, this is, when we will see the next kind of energy revolution, the revolution of renewables. And I think that's what probably for, the Baltic states in that region, this is really their future. Because again, it's not go ahead.
Sorry. No, why don't you finish your thought, please?
No, please, go ahead.
Okay, we have a question actually in our Q&A that I think is directed towards both of you. Karl, I'm going to start with you. One of our attendees has done a research paper on the behavioral tendencies of the people of Belarus and has noticed a trend of loyal followers to Lukashenko even after 30 years of corruption. And the question from our attendee is, why and what level of social commitment do these citizens have towards him? The evidence there is clear. So why are there still strong pockets of support for him, and that our attendee understands that radical views might play a factor, but it's a bit more complicated since he's been in power for so long. So Karl, we'll start with you. What would your answer to that be?
Oh, I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but I just think about corruption. You know, the corruption of the system. You know, that may be one thing. That power corrupts, and corruption certainly leads to more power. And I think that's the hold that Lukashenko has right now on his regime. But it's really a very shaky one too, because you know there isn't really much support from anywhere else. Russia kind of holds its nose and tries to support it because Belarus has been kind of a puppet of Russia. Russia can hold it in its sphere by providing cheap energy, which is a big factor, and then it relies on transport through the Baltics. I don't know if the Russians will be able to redirect that to Russia, but I think it's really the corruption. And as soon as you see that disappear or diminish, and support from Russia go away, I think like rats from a sinking ship, that the Lukashenko regime and supporters will also disappear into the night. There are questions that I might have about lustration, because that was a big issue in the Baltics and in the Central East European countries after the Berlin Wall fell and after the Baltics became independent again. Will the perpetrators and people in the regime be brought to justice, as a lesson and as a principle? And of course it's way too early to tell or see any of that happening, but that's why it's important to continue with sanctions against the regime and against individuals who support Lukashenko, including individual targeted sanctions, which include through the Magnitsky Act or the Global Magnitsky Act. And then we see other companies like Sandvine is a good instance. And Sandvine was an American-Canadian company that provided high-tech stuff, which the regime has been using to surveil citizens. And I think that company, if it's snuck around economic barriers to support Lukashenko, that should be also seen as something that the West should not support. So we've been looking into the Sandvine case and possibly sanctions against Sandvine. But there are other companies and other business deals that Western governments support with Lukashenko and other regimes, authoritarian regimes, and including Russia. So we have to look at a bigger picture and discourage those or penalize those companies that have deals with Belarus. So I hope that helped a little bit.
Yes, and then I'd like to also kick this over to Agnia to please give her perspective on this as well.
I think there's another element as well. First of all, if you look at Belarus and the last 30 years, Belarus has really been in kind of Russia's information space. So the average Belarusian has been watching Russian TV, reading Russian newspapers, being on Russian internet websites. So a lot of them do have the kind of the worldview that has been formed by Russian propaganda. And what Russian propaganda has been, especially since 2014, since the conflict in the war in Ukraine started, they have been saying, look, is that what you want to people? You think you're going to go out into the streets with demonstrations? You think you're going to have a democratic government, but what you're really going to have, you're going to have instability, you're going to have war, and you don't want that. And that has been basically their message. And it's a message also that resonates with the average person. If you're asked, well, do you really want war in your country? Do you really want Russian troops to come in? Do you really want civil war? Are you willing to stake all that? And I think the supporters, let's say supporters of Lukashenko, I doubt he has, genuine type of supporters that, just love Lukashenko and, would want to see him forever. But I think more the supporters are, it's kind of the vote, the call for stability. Let's not do anything. Let's not get, And you know, there's also the propaganda. Well, it's the U.S., it's the West that's trying to incite, you know, discord, that's trying to incite a, you know, a civil war. And do you really want that? So I think it's a little bit that people are fearful. And honestly, I do think it's a dangerous game. It is a dangerous game because Ukraine has been at war since 2014. It's cost a lot to that country, to their society, to their people, to, you know, the casualties they faced. So the same for Belarus, and I would say kind of the same for Lithuania. I mean, if a civil war or, you know, Russian troops go into Belarus, and there's, you know, fighting over territories between, you know, Lukashenko loyalists and those who are seeking a change, you know, this is, you know, again, this is kind of a, you know, it's a dangerous narrative as well. So I think it's about, and I think that's why Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's, you know, government and her platform has been, you know, very smart. They've always emphasized, all we want is, you know, just free elections. That's all we want. We're not trying to change, you know, change the geopolitical stance of Belarus. We don't want to join NATO. We don't want to join the EU. You know, we're not trying to kind of create some sort of, you know, massive change and revolution in the country. All we want is free elections, and all we want is Lukashenko, you know, if he lost, to finally leave power. And I think, you know, with this platform, that's why I think they're trying to like maintain a grasp of it. You know, so it's not to give pretext for Russia to really move in, you know, with their troops and their own agenda.
Right. Oh, and that's a great analysis. So I guess we'll kind of like segue into our last question. We do have one that ties into it with our Q&A. I wanted to talk about your national interest article, how America can save Belarus from Europe's last dictator. And this is also a question I'm posing to you, Karl, as well. The Q&A question, which ties into this, is how can we as individuals help ensure Belarusian independence? So that's kind of, you know, how we want to more or less, I guess, end this question is what can we as United States Lithuanians or even just United States citizens do to ensure Belarusian independence?
Karl, do you want to go ahead? Since you work the Hill,
I
think it's a question about, you know, the Hill and about keeping this question on the agenda, keeping this question on the, you know, Lithuanian American agenda, but I'll let you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I agree that we have to support and make sure that the Belarus Democracy, I had to write this down because they've changed the name a little bit now. It's the Belarus Democracy Human Rights and Sovereignty Act of 2020. You know, we have to make sure that it passes. It already has good support from the two foreign affairs committee leaders, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall. It has to go through a couple of other committees to pass, and that therein lies the problem, because in a very short lame duck session of Congress that we have remaining, in which the primary focus is going to be the elections in Georgia, and also, but in the House as well. Focus on the COVID, you know, COVID relief package, and on passing the appropriations bills. So that's going to take up all the time and all the attention of members of Congress in just the few weeks that they'll have remaining before the end of the session. So there's a good chance that the act may just you know, be punted into the next session. Starting in January, but then I think we have to be ready to go and ready to support that, because it does codify the you know, this whole U.S. approach towards Belarus, which includes supporting democracy and supporting civil society and media freedom and things like that, and also penalizing and sanctioning Lukashenko and his regime. So that's the best thing that we have going right now. But I think also it's very important to have everybody, and especially from the Baltic American communities, speak up. Whether it's just, you know, doing a post on social media and getting the word out, writing articles, and Agnia, it was great to see that article. And you know, there needs to be more, and just from you know, whether it's just letters or little op-ed pieces for your local newspapers. I think that's very important to share the information, because again, if we don't do it, if the Baltic American community doesn't step up, then who else is going to do it? And we just have to spread the word. And I wanted to go back and maybe just skip back into something that Jonas brought up about the cultural ties to Agnia's overview of that. And that was something that we were able to connect not only on the Baltic Way or the Baltic Belarus Way this summer, but March 25th. That's a very important anniversary for the Baltic countries and for Belarus, because for the Baltic countries it was the date that we remember when the 1949 deportations took place, and it is it's a day of mourning, but also I think a day just to remember and to never forget and remember who we are. But it's also the date of Belarusian independence in 1918. So when the first Belarusian Democratic Republic was established, then it fell on that date. We share a date, different reasons. It's maybe a happy or bittersweet for the Belarusians. It's sort of a day of remembrance for the Baltics. But I know in Washington, D.C., we were able to have some joint events with the Belarusian community at that time, and had some interesting visitors, including the former president Stanislav Shushkevich, who we were able to honor in Washington with a Truman Reagan Medal from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I served on as a board member for some years, and also many Lithuanian visitors who were in Washington on March 25th, including the former defense minister Raza Yuknevičiūtė. So we have to remember that common history for all it's worth. So I guess that's what I wanted to say.
Similarly, I'll follow. It's really keeping this issue as on the forefront, and it's difficult right now. I mean, let's face it, the US is bogged down in, kind of election issues. The United States is highly divided. I'm very sad to see, honestly, the Lithuanian American community also divided, just on the kind of posts I see on Facebook, people battling it out on Facebook versus, really our strength is in unity, not battling each other on, Trump versus Biden issues.
I absolutely agree.
Not been thrown at the organization, which does not get involved in political elections.
Yes.
Right.
Like Lithuanian Americans.
Yes, exactly.
Individuals.
Yes. No, individuals. I don't mean, your organization or the general. I just mean kind of individuals on their Facebook pages battling it out. So again, I'd like to see really more unity. And, again, there's not going to be a lot of appetite right now in Washington or among the American public for kind of new foreign policy issues. It's not going to be a priority. And that's why we have to, work as a community to keep it on the agenda. Because again, this matters long-term. This is in America's interest, really, to support democratic states. Really, I think today, if we take a step back and kind of, if I provide my kind of more geopolitical broad view, I think we are in a point of kind of, authoritarian states versus democratic states. And, for the United States, it's in our interest to support democratic states and support democratic movements. Versus, we're facing, China and Russia on the other side and all their sidekicks. Another element, I think here, it's certainly the legislative work Karl mentioned, but as well also thinking about what could be some of more preemptive, let's say, legislation the United States could potentially take to prevent Russia from really stepping in. Instead of, we saw with Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, well, it's American sanctions after the fact, right? But what can we do so Russia is, contained from taking those steps and getting, sending in its troops and tanks into Belarus? So I think that's going to be very important because, of course, how Belarus is going to go. Lukashenko greatly depends on the backing of Russia. By himself, he's certainly not going to have that domestic internal support to maintain power.
Okay, great. I really appreciate your time, both of you. I think really quick, we will answer this question in the next segment too, because it also applies, but we had a question from one of our Canadian counterparts, and she was asking, protesting and civil advocacy in the time of COVID and social distancing, like what advice would you guys have for Baltic youth if they want to get involved in protest movements, and what new avenues are there to kind of facilitate that now that we kind of have to be very separate from each other?
Well, you've all been doing a good job with Zoom meetings. I know you had a chat with Congressman Shimkus recently, and it's great. I think that's just the world that we live in right now. So practice our writing skills, pick up the telephone, and call, and let's just stay in touch. But we've adapted a little bit. Wish we could get back to where we were before COVID, and I'm sure we will. But we'll have to muddle through with different technologies in the meantime.
And on the other hand, this creates new opportunities. Being able to connect virtually, being able to call someone, having a meeting with someone, even though you're in different locations, it's accepted now, and I think it creates a little bit more opportunities. More people are maybe willing to, jump on a call or jump on a Zoom meeting than they would be, flying out somewhere, or even, accepting an in-person meeting. So
it's much cheaper too.
Yes.
That's true. All right. Well, I think that's about all the time we have today. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you taking time out of your Sunday to educate Lithuanian youth about the current goings on in Belarus. So you can either stay for our next segment, or, if you must go, we will bid you goodbye, and then we'll see you again for another panel sometime soon. Yone, do you want to go over what we're doing next?
Yeah, and Agnia, Karl, please, if you can, if you're willing, could you share your contact information in the chat?
Yes.
Agnia, the article that you wrote, because it's important that we continue to share information and educate our attendees. As both of you explained incredibly well,